Welcome to the YouTube channel on poverty and culture. Our channel is dedicated to understanding how culture affects poverty and other social problems. Through discussions with our guests, we hope to understand that connection more deeply and thus find better answers. Our host is Larry Mead, a longtime scholar of poverty and welfare reform and the author of the recent Burdens of Freedom. Our initial ideas about culture come from this book, but the discussion may take us in new directions. Mark Bauerlein is a professor of English at Emory University and senior editor of the journal First Things. He also conducts the podcast First Things about current political and moral issues.
Well, welcome to our audience. I'm Larry Mead from New York University. We appreciate your interest in our subject, namely poverty and culture. And I just want to say a few words about what we mean by culture. Culture basically is what people think life's about. What is it about? What are we trying to do and be? And also, the great fact about America is that we are culturally divided, that we do not have a consistent culture nationwide. The dominant culture is an individualist culture that came from Europe with most of the immigrants that formed the society. But we also have a number of groups that came from outside the Western world, racial minorities, Blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, Asians. These groups are coming from a different place. And this means that we have some significant problems in integrating the society. Now, I just want to briefly describe what the main differences are between Western and non-Western culture. Western culture is inner-driven. It's basically shaped by the goals that individuals themselves choose, and their lives are organized around achieving those goals. It's also a culture that's moralistic about right and wrong. People have abstract, generalized ideas about right and wrong, which they usually internalize in childhood, and that keeps them on the rails for most of their life. Non-Western culture is more cautious in that it's more oriented to adjusting to the outside world rather than seeking change. It's less individualist. People think of themselves as members of groups rather than as individuals. And the moral structure is based much more on external authority. People do what they are expected to do by the people around them. And we don't have the same inner structure of absolute rights and wrongs, which Westerners tend to have. So these are the major differences, and they lead to significant struggles within the society. Now, two essential things to notice at the outset. First of all, neither culture is superior to the others. Western culture is good at some things, but not good at some other things. And the same is true for the non-West. Also, we're not assuming that everyone's alike. There's a lot of diversity within both the West and the non-West, even though this general contrast is a reality. The other thing that's crucial is that these cultural differences are not necessarily tied to race at all. It's true that right now, most people who come from the Western background are white. Most people who come from the non-Western world are non-white, but that isn't necessary. There's really no reason why, other than historical accident, that people from races are associated with different cultures. And as we'll see, there's a fair amount of complexity where some people who come from a non-Western background have become individualists, and also some other people who come from a European background have abandoned individualism. So there's a fair amount of complexity to talk about. Okay, so that's a brief summary, and now I'm going to ask for Mark's reactions.
Well, I'm hoping that the people tuning in have some familiarity with your situation after you published the book on poverty and culture, laying out this thesis in which you try to mark out how long backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, have manifested in various economic and social outcomes for different groups. We've got disparities in income, in educational achievement, in social dysfunction that are quite stark. And when you turn to, just broadly speaking, cultural difference, Larry, you're hitting a third rail.
Yeah.
In the liberal vision. Just cultural difference in broad terms, because I don't know how many of your critics even read your book, right? They simply saw you looking for cultural difference as part of the explanation for the disparities that we continue to see. And this is a no-no. This is something that might lead to judgment of one culture being superior to another relative to the economic system that we have today. So, and I add that relative to in order to not disagree with what you said about one culture not being superior to another, unless we add a particular outcome. Okay, relative to this outcome, one culture does better than another. One acculturation, I should say, does better than another. That the inferior culture might do better relative to another measure. Very well.
I support that. That's exactly right. I don't think that culture is superior in general. There's some real limitations in Western culture, but it's very good at assembling wealth and power. And it's that that's driven the West to dominance.
Well, and what you said about the liberalism, sort of the general outlook, especially among the successful people in America today, is individualistic. As you put it, it is an individualist ethos that focuses on, again, achievement. I think you used the word achievement, success, productivity, prosperity, flourishing, very much more and more measured in monetary terms. Yeah. This is sort of a classical liberalism. And the problem is, this, I think, is where liberalism is in a real bind. And you point out the bind, and it's very difficult for them to absorb. Yeah. What happens when the economy shifts more and more into rewards for people who are very good at the handling of words and numbers, right? When it becomes more and more a knowledge economy, an information economy, an economy that rewards increasingly high SAT skills.
Well, okay, that's all true. I agree with that. But the main argument that I'm making actually isn't simply about which culture generates the most wealth and power. It's pretty clear what that is. It's rather that people in the non-Western world who come here have major adjustments to make if they're going to be at home in America. And especially minorities that are coming from Latin America, Africa, also Asia, and to a greater extent that we realize, they have a hard time coming to terms with America. And that creates serious problems for us, quite aside from differences in wealth. And that's what we really have to focus on. And the advantage of doing that is that we get away from the current obsessive focus on race and racism. The anti-racism movement basically has blamed all Black problems on white society. Now, I'm not saying there's no racism in America. Obviously, there are still racists, but that is not our major problem now. The experts that I know believe that the major difficulty is simply that people from non-Western backgrounds, especially Blacks and Hispanics, understand life as survival. It's getting through the day. It's moving from one place to the next place, but not really have any long-term goals. And it's the inability to plan and commit oneself to a set of goals that causes people to get in trouble. And then they don't get ahead here. So they could do a whole lot better if they had something more like the inner-driven temperament of the West. So that's what we have to promote in our anti-poverty policies. And it so happens that the programs that do that most effectively have exactly the character you would expect. They're essentially teaching young adolescent people from non-Western backgrounds to approach life in these terms. And if they do that, then they get a lot further. And they're less likely to get in trouble. So the message here is that there's an important way to progress in our social problems, and we don't have to blame anybody. We don't have to say that either Blacks or whites are responsible for the situation. In fact, they have to work together to overcome this. and promote assimilation to the individualist culture. And the example here comes from many Blacks and Hispanics who've done exactly that. We have a Black middle class, which has been able to get ahead because they have taken on what I call the burdens of freedom. They have become individualists, and they're doing just fine. They may have other issues, but they're a lot less distressing than what we see at the bottom of society, where people are simply not getting anywhere. And that's what we have to focus on. So you're right that the left resists this argument because they want to blame somebody for what's going on at the bottom. They want white society to be made responsible. And the reason why whites accept that blame is actually forecast in their own culture, because part of individualist culture is precisely to be moralistic about one's own shortcomings. So white society, individualist society, is willing to be self-critical, even to excess. And that's what we see today. Whites are groveling at the feet of activists for anti-racism, as if they were responsible for all the problems. Now, that isn't really true. I don't think they themselves believe it, but this is the automatic reflex of an elite culture. And it doesn't do any good because it doesn't direct attention to the changes that are really needed in order to produce integration.
Look, Larry, do you think that this problem wasn't so bad when you had a larger manufacturing industry in America where one could leave high school, and you graduate from high school in Torrance, California, in 1949, and then you go work in Hughes Aircraft, right, the big aviation industry in Los Angeles, and you could stay there for 30, 40 years.
Yeah,
could raise a family on a single income. You could regard your employer in a much less individualistic, competitive, adversarial position. So it didn't require so much of this individualist ethos that we have today, that there was a path that didn't strike one as so in conflict with, let's just say, a more non-Western approach to one's life.
I wish that were true, Mark. I really do. But in fact, the evidence doesn't support that. There were always well-paid factory jobs. That's true. But they were never typical of the low-skilled economy. Blacks used to do the low-skilled jobs that they are now typically not doing on a steady basis. And therefore, they're getting ahead worse than they would have done had they taken those jobs. The loss of the well-paid factory job is a minor part of our problem, actually, because the difficulty is that to hold any job, you have to show up every day in the morning. You have to cooperate with the boss, with your coworkers. You have to take on responsibilities. We tend to say that a good job or some other benefit that society provides is a gift, something we see it as an opportunity. We don't see the obligation that goes with it, that you have to accept a set of responsibilities to hold a job. That's a major burden of freedom, is to do that. And Blacks, also Hispanics, have trouble doing that. It isn't just that they can't do the jobs, which are more technical now than they used to be, but they actually don't show up regularly. And even if you provide jobs and training and other benefits, the difficulty is to get people from disadvantaged backgrounds to commit themselves to those programs, to show up every day and to learn the skills and then go out and get a job. See, all those programs presume an individualist temperament, and that's precisely the thing that's lacking. So we can't assume that it's just a change in the external economy that produces this.
Look, Larry, let me just ask you a big question. That is, of course, a complicated answer, but why have we gone in 1965 to 25% fatherlessness in families to now we're kids, now the birth rate is about 72%, no father in the home.
For Blacks.
Yeah. What happened?
Okay, I think what happened is that Blacks came north from the South, where they were in a structure of authority that was largely external. See, after they came from Africa, Southern whites realized that they needed an external authority structure in order to function in the plantation economy. And that's what Jim Crow and slavery were all about, was providing that external structure. But then in the 20th century, by stages, blacks move north from the South. And when they come to northern cities, they don't discover that same external authority structure. On the contrary, the dominant culture is now individualist. It takes for granted that people are able to discipline their own lives, to take on the burdens of freedom. But blacks are not able to do that because that isn't where they're coming from. And it takes a while to assimilate the individualist temperament of the main economy. So in the 60s, blacks find themselves without any source of authority, either inner or outer. And that's why the family collapses after civil rights rather than before. This is what the standard academic theory is, that black family falls apart because of Jim Crow and injustice. No, on the contrary.
No way.
It falls apart after the elimination of Jim Crow. That is the real problem. Now, what happened after that is that society struggled to restore a largely external authority structure. And that's what we did through criminal justice reform, through welfare reform, to some extent by toughening standards in the schools. We have, in fact, restored much of the order that was destroyed in the 60s. And that is very, very different from the standard account. Now, this is also true of Hispanics. Many people will say, well, the whole black problem goes back to slavery. Okay, but most Hispanics didn't come here as slaves. They came here voluntarily. But they have the same social problems as blacks, not quite as severe. But when they cross the border from Mexico, the families start to deteriorate immediately because nobody's in charge. The traditional social pressures that kept the family together in Mexico and Latin America are absent mostly in America. So unless you have an inner commitment to maintaining your family, it's not going to live on. So today, about half of all Hispanic children are born outside marriage, almost at the black rate, which is 70%. So the collapse of the family is very parallel to what we see among blacks. And the reason is the same. Hispanics have not yet taken on the burdens of freedom. And when they do that, then the family's going to come back together and you'll see the whole group start to do better.
You know, Larry, my colleagues who went to Princeton and Harvard, got their PhDs there, and went to prep schools in Massachusetts and New Hampshire and the nicer parts of New Jersey. I'm not sure they would like the idea that when blacks left the South and went north, things got worse for them.
I know. No, it's an unpopular idea.
But you know, I was doing a radio show a couple of years ago, and it came up. The host was very liberal, and he had me on. He was open. It was a good discussion, but a lot of tough questions. But he talked about the rollback of voting rights in the South that is taking place. He talked about it as the return of Jim Crow, and I said to him, "Well, you're going to have to tell all those African Americans who are young, who are moving to South Carolina, they're moving to Atlanta, where I lived for a long time, they're moving to Tennessee. How do you explain this reverse migration going on right now?"
Yeah, you're right. And I totally oppose these moves to restrict voting in the South. It doesn't look like Jim Crow. I totally agree with that. I'm opposed to it. It's a big mistake. But we should not imagine that restores the kind of life that blacks lived under Jim Crow. That really isn't true. And the collapse of the black family is pretty much nationwide in the South as well as the North. And this is a terrible problem for this group because their kids go to school and they're really not ready for school because the school assumes that you have an individual's temperament, that you're prepared to go in there and learn what you're supposed to learn and compete with other students. This is very, very tough. And a number of authors, I'm thinking of Hispanics now, they describe the culture of the school as really scary for Hispanic parents. They're not used to this. The idea that life isn't just survival, that you have to go out there and compete against other people who want the same things that you want. That's really hard. And that is, of course, the key to American dynamism and productivity is that we have that. And we expect even the children of the elite to go to school and compete against other people. And we don't give them anything on a plate. I went to a very tough prep school and I went to a very tough college and graduate school. The idea that that life was a life of privilege is true in some sense, but I worked my ever-living butt off. And you did too, I'm sure, in getting yourself started. So life isn't actually easy. The hard thing to explain about Western culture isn't really that it's a free culture. It's almost the opposite, that it's a culture of obligation. And the heaviest obligations are those that come from your own goals. The things that you're trying to achieve are the things that structure your life. Those are the heaviest burdens of freedom. And that is what you have to be able to tolerate in order to achieve anything in this country. So that is really hard, and that isn't the standard rhetoric.
Larry, what would an elementary school curriculum, what would the shift look like in order for it not to frighten Hispanic parents?
Yeah. What we have is a number of charter schools that have shown the capacity to instill in very young children the structures that are needed in order to get ahead later in life. I'm thinking particularly of the success sequence in New York City, also the kipp schools, one of which started in the Bronx, and they have a chain across the country. These schools are characterized by a regime of extreme clarity about fundamental expectations. They set very clear academic standards, but they also are very insistent on maintaining order. And they basically suppress all of the wasteful interactions that poor kids go through interacting with each other and just rapping on each other. All of that gets put down, and the kids have to focus on the teacher and learning. And that's why they learn much more. And then when those kids take the standardized tests, which everyone has to take, they do as well or even better than kids in the suburbs who are coming from much stronger families. So what the schools have done is take over the parenting of the child, and especially to plant these early obligations about good behavior, which are essential to what you do later in life. Now, individualism is not all about order. It's also about freedom and choosing your path in life. But in order to choose your path and not be deflected from it, you have to know what the expectations are. And that is what the top charter schools do. Now, they're not typical of all charters. The average charter isn't any more successful than the average ordinary public school. So it's not easy to build a school that has this kind of intensity. And the teachers tend to burn out, all kinds of problems achieving it. But those schools really do change the personality of the child. And then they are able to go on to college in many cases.
The kipp schools, as you put it, essentially take over the parenting task. I mean, they keep the kids past 5 p.m. They take the kids in on Saturday. And a lot of it is designed to say, we are going to provide forms of order and routine and rationality that actually these kids aren't getting anywhere else. So it really does become, we're going to be the parents. However, kids leave the kipp schools and other charters like that, and a few years later, we find that it didn't stick.
That's true. And the long-term impact is not as great as we'd like so far. That's true. Yeah. But it's still a lot better than nothing. Typically, kids will be able to get through college and get a credential and then be able to get a more middle-class job than they otherwise could do. And it's really all about order at a really profound level. I heard a story from David Whitman, who wrote a book on the top charter schools, called Sweating the Small Stuff. And he told me a story that at the kipp school in the Bronx, that the key teacher is an orchestra conductor who requires everyone to enter the orchestra and learn an instrument and then learn how to play various pieces of music. And he describes a scene where the students are giving a performance, basically, and they're up on the stage tuning their instruments, and their parents are in the audience waiting to hear them play. And the conductor comes on the stage and steps up on the podium and raises a baton, and suddenly there's pin drop silence. They're waiting for the downbeat, and in the next instant, the parents break down in tears of joy. Why? Because their kids have shown self-command.
Yeah.
Shown self-command. They can do what is expected. Then they play the music. you see, and that self-command is the thing that most poor kids don't have. And they don't have it because their parents didn't have it. And their parents didn't have it, going way back. But the parents also live lives of survival, of getting through the day. And they don't manifest that through organization and commitment, you can, in fact, get control of your life. And it's because they don't do that, the kids get the idea that they can't be relied upon. So the typical kid in a poor family gives up on his parents. Then he has to go to school, and he now doesn't trust the teacher because the teacher is like the parent, and later on doesn't trust the boss. So authority figures never get compliance from kids from these backgrounds, and then they can't get ahead. These are the men that end up on the street panhandling in New York. That's where you end up if you can't hold a job, and you can't hold a job because you're not able to internalize the burdens of freedom.
Larry, you probably heard of forms of separatism that have set in, for instance, with Black students at elite colleges demanding their own dormitories, their own events. They want to be taught their own heritage by people like them. This is a standard demand. Is this a misplaced way of coping with the tensions they're undergoing between adapting to this achievement individualistic model and the cultural backgrounds that they still carry?
Yes, you've got it. In fact, that's the key. The typical anti-Black activist or anti-racist activist that you see among college students has a foot in both camps. He is coming typically from a less structured family. He's a good student and therefore gets picked up by the system and given admission to a school like Emory or NYU, a selective school with real demands. And then he has to cope with a primarily individualist culture at the school, which prizes argument and discussion and research and all these things that leave uncertain what the truth is. And that's very hard for people from a non-Western background because they assume authorities are in charge. They defer to authority. But here's a culture in which there is no deference to authority. The professor has to make his case, and that's hard. So they're threatened by this, even though they're in it. And one response is to challenge the authority figures, believing that they can't be what they think, and also to talk about those who are not at the college because they're not organized enough to get in. I mean, the typical activist is advocating for lower income Blacks who are very, very unlike himself. They're showing the most extreme non-Western culture, a culture of survival. And one reason why the demands are so extreme, so hard to deal with, is that we have people who are essentially individualist in temperament, making demands on behalf of a population that is quite different from themselves. This is quite different from Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. See, Martin Luther King represented the Black middle class. He represented the figures who had made themselves individualists in order to deal with America, the Black clergy, the lawyers, all those people. The people who followed Martin Luther King were very much like him. They were college students, and they were protesting Jim Crow. See, for them, it was possible to be free because they had taken on the burdens of freedom. They were unfree inwardly, and that made them outwardly free and very formidable. And they were able to challenge Jim Crow successfully. But today, the anti-racist activists are essentially alone. They're speaking on behalf of the Black poor, but the Black poor isn't organized and isn't able to follow them, isn't able to support them. So in fact, what they want is freedom. That might be good for them because they are organized enough to benefit from it. But the typical low-income Black today does not benefit from freedom. No, they have to internalize the organization, the inhibitions, the self-command that our culture demands. And of course, the activists don't say that. They think that white society has some magic power to advance Black America just by willing it. No, that's not going to happen. White America is no longer racist on the whole at all, but we don't accept that there is a cultural problem. And the cultural problem is that the people at the bottom who we would like to help are not organized enough to be able to be helped. We can't just give them something because they're Black. We have to say, no, you have to function. You have to get a job. we'll give you a job, we'll give you training, but you have to show up. You have to show that and we take for granted that they're going to show the inner commandedness that allows them to fulfill their responsibilities. That's hard if, in fact, all the things you've reacted to in life have been outside pressures of various kinds, and you're trying to survive. Survival doesn't get you the organized life that you need in order to take advantage of opportunity in America.
Well, you know, you're at NYU. I was at Emory for a long time. We see a lot of students coming in who are shooting for graduate degrees,
Sure.
med, pre-law, all the rest. And in recent years, I'll have to say, I've started to see a lot of unhappiness among these high achievers.
Yeah.
And is the competition getting to be too much? I mean, when I went to college at UCLA, I started in 1977.
Yeah.
I had a B average in high school. I went to public high school. We didn't have a lot of money, and I worked through college, but I was only, paying $500 a year back then. But I got in to UCLA pretty easily. If I sent my application in today, they would laugh and throw it. It would go right into the wastebasket. 120,000 people apply to UCLA every year. And I mean, is the competition for everyone? White students, Ivy League, prep school, public school, is it chewing everybody up more and more?
I agree with that. And the well-functioning students at the top are also under great pressure. I have two kids myself, one of whom is about to enter senior year in high school. He's sweating the colleges. America is not for the faint of heart. It's a competitive society in which you have to do your best. But the thing I also tell students that there's always another chance, and the game isn't over. Maybe you don't do well at a particular stage in the game, but if you believe in yourself and you have a goal and you pursue it, then in fact you can get somewhere. And that's happened to me. My career is not straight line at all. When I left graduate school, I expected to become a professor, doing the kind of thing that you've done in the English field. No, it didn't happen. I had to go to Washington. I had to start over as a public policy expert. But that turned out to be better. That was actually more important than what I had studied in graduate school. And I was able to make a career out of that. That was very fortunate. And I think America is not a rigid structure such that there isn't a chance to find movement forward, but you do have to be organized. The thing we can't allow and haven't allowed, really can't allow, is people to get ahead who are not organized, who are not able to set a goal at all, and therefore don't get anywhere.
Let me, big question about this liberal, small L, the liberal individualist ethos that involves competition and success. Larry, what does it give young people in terms of the deep meaning of life? Where does it does it require, in order to compete, does it require a certain rootlessness, a lack of foundations, of grounds, of a strong sense of being in some way?
Yes, I think it does require that. And you're faced with unexpected reverses, things that you don't expect. I've always taken inspiration from the first words that God says to Abraham in the book of Genesis. He says to him, "Leave your country and your kindred and your father's house and go to a country that I will show you." He doesn't describe the country, he just says, "Come and follow me, and you will go to the country that I will show you." Now, that is not the way most people live in the non-Western world. Most people in the non-Western never leave home. They stay right where they were born. They grow up in families and extended families and tribes and villages, and they ascend to greater authority over time as they get older. They don't go off to a country that I will show you. This is a Jewish idea. And after that, a Christian idea and a Western idea. And that It takes, enormous gumption. And in my book, I end the introduction by summing up the image of the pilgrims who sailed the Atlantic to found what became the American colonies. And they crossed the Atlantic in sailing ships, and about half of them died. I mean, this is crazy behavior, but you do believe in a mission. And they did. And of course, that changed the world. The America is full of people who are prepared to leave their home and their kindred and their father's house and go to a new country. And it's that willingness which gives Americans dynamism. And it's a precious, precious thing. And I don't want to see it lost because of the failure to see its importance. And also because of immigration, which is bringing into the country large numbers of people who are coming from the non-Western world and who have a very different idea about what life's about. And we can't just assume that they hit the ground running and do what previous immigrants have done. Those immigrants mostly came from Europe, and therefore they had an individualist temperament coming in. Today, they're coming from Latin America, and especially from Central America. They're coming from Asia, so on. Those societies are not dynamic in the way America has been, because the people who live there are mostly oriented to adjusting to what the authorities tell them to do. They're deferring to necessity. They're not creating a new world by some inspiration that they have.
Look, Larry, identity politics are really getting ferocious in many sectors.
Yes.
That is certainly contrary to the liberal individualistic ethos. And it's very powerful. And some of the most individualistic institutions, like the elite colleges and corporations, are at least they say they're buying into the new woke sensibility. Is this a genuine challenge to the individualistic achievement model?
Well, yes, because it says that your status and your characteristics are what matter. And the woke temperament assumes that the position of the less favored groups in America has been dictated by what white America decided. And therefore, the white Americans, they control any change in that system. Well, I don't believe that. I think America is a strongly competitive country among whites, among all the groups. And the woke temperament is actually an expression of non-Western culture, where power is always assigned to the environment, always assigned to something outside yourself. And that's true if you're coming from most of the non-Western world. These countries are indeed worlds in which you don't have opportunity, in which there is massive injustice, instability, misrule. That's why many people in these worlds, indeed millions of people in these worlds, are trying to escape to the West, because they don't want to live in a world where they don't have any opportunity. But then when they come here, they discover that they are faced with new demands, the demands of freedom. And the woke temperament is an attempt to preserve reliance on outside forces in a society that's given to inside forces, which believes in the pursuit of individual purpose. And so if you overload that, if you say, well, now what counts is whether you're Black or Hispanic or various other groups that have been defined, when you do that, you give up your freedom. You're saying that some outside force is responsible for your future. Well, that's partly true. We none of us have complete control over our lives. I haven't had control. My life has been disrupted a number of times by strange events, but also favorable events. And the point is, you react to these in the way that allows you to pursue your goals. And you don't get defeated. You don't give up because something goes wrong. No, you try again, do something else. And eventually you find something that works. And if you do that, you can make a real contribution. And the reason it works is when you have a whole society that does that, the productivity that you get is vastly greater than in a more differential, traditional society, where people are taking orders. They get told what to do, and they don't have much choice about it. Well, in America, there's confusion about what you should do. I've spent a lot of time counseling students about what they might do after college. They often don't know what they want to do. I tell a lot of them that they shouldn't just go automatically off to law school, as many of them think that's the answer. No, they have to decide what they want. And it took me a number of years to figure out what I wanted. But when you do that, then you have something you can put your weight behind and actually accomplish something. But it takes inner-driven confidence, courage. America is not for the faint of heart. It's a genuinely demanding society, and we should not imagine otherwise. And that's why it's so powerful. I mean, there's a reason why America gets to be what it is, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. And minority groups who tend to assign power to the outside forces, they have to realize that they also have power. They can achieve things, and they should go set about doing it. And that's the message that the kids ought to get in school from the very time they walk in the door.
Yeah. I've been told that if they removed affirmative action at Princeton, say, and we judged applications solely on merit, forget holistic stuff, that all those spaces that went to African American and Hispanic students would not go to whites. They would actually go to Asians. Now, the Asians, are they a model for you of how one can accommodate a strong sense of family and tradition and achievement in this U.S. situation?
The Asians, I think, are less successful than their typical image. They do well up through school because school is a structure defined by other people, designed by people in authority. That's what education means in Asia. You go to school in Asia, you basically learn what the teacher says and you cough it back on tests and papers, and then you do well and you get a place in the system. But that's not America. That's true in America up through school, but then when you get to college, we expect people to think for themselves, to have their own ideas. In fact, we encourage them to challenge the teacher. That's very disorienting to people from Asia, I've found. They're disturbed to see an authority figure like me, or it could be you, standing up in front of a class and inviting challenge to see what other arguments might be made about a certain question. And they're disturbed by that. And because they have trouble finding their own direction, Asians actually have a hard time in getting ahead after school. There was a recent study published by Harvard Business School that appeared in The Economist, which says that explicitly, that actually Asians, they mean particularly East Asians, have a hard time getting to the top in business because they don't show individualism. And this is what Harvard is doing when it rejects a lot of Asian applicants. That was the point of the lawsuit about affirmative action or about preferences anyway, in the Harvard case. Harvard turns down a lot of applicants that look like they have superb credentials, and the Asians are saying they must be prejudiced against us. No, because Harvard is asking for more than that. They're asking for people with a sense of direction. They want to see students who know where they're going, who have an idea about what they hope to do. And it may change, of course, but you have to have purpose. Your goal in going to Harvard is not to please the teachers and not to be patted on the head, but to discover what you think is really important. That's what I did when I was at Harvard. And I didn't have it all figured out then, but I had questions that I was interested in. And I came to partial solutions to those questions. And then I left academia and went into government where the same questions reappeared. And I ended up writing books about poverty and welfare reform. And those questions and the arguments made there were distinctive because they were coming out of a different experience than most people had. And that has some real impact on public policy. Okay, I could not have done that if I hadn't been asking those questions going through school. If I just imbibed what other experts told me about poverty and welfare, I would never have hit on those ideas. When I went into the field and interviewed people in welfare programs and work programs, I discovered realities which none of them had seen. And I couldn't explain it. Why haven't they seen this? Well, they were looking for something else. They weren't looking for the same thing. And so they didn't see it. But what I saw turned out to be very important in explaining welfare reform. So, you've got to have your own direction. You've got to believe in it. And that allows you to achieve something. Now, you may not everything you do succeeds. That's certainly been true in my case. You can't expect every project to work out, but you roll the dice. You take a shot. You do the best you can. And the willingness to do that is the thing that makes this country so enormously powerful, because people do not settle for what they have, but seek to go on to something more.
Just one quick point, Larry. You said that colleges they want kids to come in to think for themselves, to ask questions. No, I don't want my students to think this. I talk, they listen, and they take in what I tell them. That
really,
that's my. But question: what do you think the woke movement would take from your book? Would they object to the first premise of cultural difference?
Yeah.
And the
I think they would, because it's a new idea which hasn't been pressed before. It's based upon research on world cultural differences by a bunch of other scholars, like 15 of them, a large number. And they all say the same thing about this contrast between the inner-driven Western temperament versus the outer-driven non-West. That is consistent through all this research. So somehow it's never been noticed. We basically don't allow ourselves to think that people from different backgrounds are in any way different. I think we probably think we believe that because of civil rights. If we were to treat anyone as different from anyone else, it would somehow be an act of prejudice. No, this is not about race. This is about what you think life's about. And the differences are enormous. They're simply very important. And you can't just ignore them. We can't just assume everyone's the same. We have to make use. Now, there's some value in having differences. I'm not totally against that at all. But if we want to assimilate people coming in from other societies, we have to tell them, hey, this is an individual society where you seek to get ahead. You have to decide what you want and go after it. And if you do that, you will have lots of friends because they're doing the same thing, and they will ally with you in mutual projects. That's what de Tocqueville found when he came to America in 1830. He found a society made up of energetic people seeking their own goals, but also able to collaborate with each other for common goals. And
well, I think that what you pinpoint here is really the dilemma for the liberal elite, at least the intellectual academic world, because they act these assumptions out, but they explicitly will not tell people you must adapt. They want to play the cultural relativist game at the same time that they work in these hyper-competitive worlds, and they reward people for doing well, and they get rid of people who don't do well. This, I think, is part of the anger that followed your book and some of the other things that you had written. You're pointing out something that they know is true.
Well, the biggest change, and this has come to me by talking to my classmates at Amherst College, where I went as an undergraduate. At Amherst, when I went there, it was a severe academic boot camp where the faculty pressed all the students to be more and more clear, more and more logical, and more persuasive of whatever they read or said or wrote, and so on. And it was very tough. But now the atmosphere at Amherst is very different. According to people who've been there, I've been there on one visit and others have been there. They say now it's all about inclusion, about community, and about acceptance of diversity. And that's because I think the reason is that the college, like other colleges, is trying to recruit students from disadvantaged backgrounds, not only minorities, but other people who've just had a hard time and come from low-income families, and they want them, and these students are often very able. However, when they get to Amherst, they then suddenly find this brutally competitive environment in which they're up against other very, very good students. And I noticed this when I was there, and so did my classmates. We were all terrified of each other. We were much better at impressing other people than ourselves. We all had doubts whether we could really do it. And the college, therefore, has eased off on the demands they make on the students once they get there, because they can't assume that they're going to be ready for it. And they have to, therefore, be more supportive than they would have been in my time.
Larry,
the culture is changing.
These college presidents like Biddy Martin
Yeah.
at Amherst and Salovey at Yale, the word inclusion should never ever come out of their mouths. I mean, Salovey, he did an op-ed in the Wall Street variant of it 7 times in a little op-ed. Yale's admissions rate is about 6%, and they want to make it 5%. They are trying to be as exclusive as they possibly can. This is part of the double dealing that they are engaged in all the time. You guys, it's just, I think the Black students who are angry, who are protesting, they've got a good case because they've been lied to. They've been told, come to our campus, you will thrive. We are so inclusive. We value diversity. You are going to be so happy and successful here. And then these kids who have 85% math SAT percentile, very high in the African-American community, they're suddenly in calculus 2 with kids with the 98th percentile. And suddenly life at Yale isn't so good. And they don't understand because precisely they've been lied to by the leadership, Larry.
That I think that you're onto something. I really think that the Black students that I met here at NYU are not at all lacking in ability. They're definitely smart, and they have individualist features, but they're not terribly tough. But faced with adversity, competition, reverses, criticism, they tend to react negatively because they take it averse. They think that this is aimed at them in some way. No, I mean, a lot of my students can't write the English language. I'm sure you've noticed this. They make common grammatical errors. Okay, I correct that stuff. Okay, I give points for writing well. And many students take averse to that. Okay, well, tough. When you leave here, your boss is going to care whether you can write a letter that he's willing to sign.
Indeed.
This is important. But that's hard. And I remember this when I was an undergraduate. Amherst was very severe, and we all got beaten up by Amherst. You had to have a thick skin. I think America is a place where you need a thick skin. You have to be willing to take criticism and feedback in order to get somewhere.
Last question, Larry. We got a couple more minutes. Yeah. You talk about America as a place where you need a thick skin. Larry, skins are getting thinner and thinner all the time. The sensitivity regime is growing constantly. The I'm offended. I mean, if I were in a meeting in 1980 when I was an undergraduate and someone gave a talk and one of my fellow students got up and said, I'm offended by what you said about such things. The rest of us would have gone, what are you, a baby? I mean, come on. But now that is a final question, Larry. How is this going to play out over the next 10 years?
I think a lot hinges on the rate of immigration. One thing Trump managed to do is cut that rate back sharply. And the upshot was the country didn't grow much in terms of population. That was favorable to assimilation. We ought to keep the intake low. We ought to change the schools to be like those charter schools I was talking about, in which students get clear messages about what's expected. And then they're able to go on and live a free life. That's the most important single thing. And there are other programs that I would build up, but we have to have support for that. And right now, it doesn't look good because Congress has, in fact, decided to throw money at problems without asking about whether people are functioning or not. They are, in fact, rejecting welfare reform, where we required welfare mothers to work in return for aid. Now they will get aid without working at all. That's a mistake. I know the conservatives think that that's a bad idea. We should expect something. Again, freedom isn't free. Freedom does require that you assume certain responsibilities. And we should expect that. And if we do that, then the country will go on being a great force for good and power in the world.
I don't think the Biden administration is going to be pulling you in, Larry.
No, I don't think so either. I've been trying to get the last two administrations to research programs of the kind that I like for various groups in Washington, and I haven't had much success. Ever since Obama, the people in charge of federal research have been wedded to policies that are strictly voluntary, that involve helping people, do not require them to do anything in return, do not require good behavior. That isn't the life that I lived growing up. I lived a life of high demands, and I was surprised to find that many other people didn't face the same rigors. Well, that's not.
Did you see that Governor DeSantis in Florida has included a employment effort component to welfare, to job benefits?
Great idea. I mean, now to put welfare into a structure where work is required, that's not easy to do. I wrote several books about how to do it. It's not easy, but it can be done. The leading example of this was Wisconsin in the late 90s and early 2000s. Wisconsin really did change welfare into a system where you had to work in order to get aid. And they did all kinds of other things to help you. The idea was not necessarily to keep people off welfare, to make sure, but rather to say that they would do something in return, and that was essential to their belonging in the society. And that's the message we have to get here. America is not for people who just exist. You don't get something because you're here as a citizen. No, you have to function in certain ways. And you do that, then you have many other people who are willing to work with you on the things that you want to do. And you're not going to be alone. You're going to be part of a great force that's moving forward in the world.
I enjoyed it. Was a good discussion. Thank you for clarifying a lot of that. I'm actually probably more pessimistic about the future than you are. I actually think that this country has jumped on a downward slide that is not going to be reversed. It'll slow down, it'll take different directions, but I see an inevitable decline taking place in America.
Well, I have to say, I hope you're wrong, but I respect your analysis. I think you're saying something that could happen.
Yep.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark.